everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining this important discussion this afternoon. There have been a lot of jokes this week about trying to find nature in the ocean in the blue zone, so thank you all for finding it. So today we are going to be discussing blue natural capital projects and rights in blue natural capital projects. And our speakers today, if I start at that end, Leah Glass, Technical Advisor at Sylvester & Associates and Blue Ventures. Then we've got Ruth Boumphrey, CEO of Lloyds Registry Foundation. Then Suraj Vanniarachchy, Vice President Global Carbon for Macquarie. Then Dr. Josheena Naggea, Hoffman, Ocean Innovation Fellow at the World Economic Forum. And then Lisa Schindler, Murrey, Director of Natural Climate Solutions at RARE. So thank you so much for all joining me today. So blue carbon and blue natural capital as a whole has grown a lot in recent years. And the topic has now sort of transcended multiple sectors, not just the NGO and scientific space, but into private sector and philanthropic conversations. Today we're looking at blue natural capital rather than just carbon and the sort of voluntary carbon market, which has built momentum, but we're seeing an increase in other types of markets such as biodiversity credits that are also going to be touching these coastal ecosystems and the communities that live there. And we really want to sort of look beyond carbon and understand that these ecosystems provide essential benefits and as well as coastal adaptation and mitigation against climate change. And the communities that live there are often those on the front line of climate change, and indigenous knowledge is so important to sort of integrate and build into these projects. So we're going to start with Lisa. So last year at COP27, the high quality principle and guidance for blue carbon were launched. It was a partnership across multiple NGOs, which Lisa will go into in more detail. But the principles were sort of designed to ensure that projects have a real emissions reductions, environmental and social integrity, and also equitable benefit sharing for local communities. And there are 5 pillars, and one of these pillars is the Empower People principle. And also the sort of other one is operate locally and contextually, and Josheena is going to be touching on that pillar. But I just wanted to ask sort of what are the next steps for these principles and guidance, and what are the next steps for Empower People and how to integrate that into projects?
Thanks, Maddie. So maybe before I jump into the Empower People pillar, I guess it's good to just think about how it came from, and hearing all of the interest in blue carbon, particularly over the last few years, and realizing that having a set of common principles, building off of what we've seen with REDD+ and other terrestrial nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation, it allows us to kind of use those principles and that history to be able to bring that level of integrity and operationalization into blue carbon. And so for over the last few years, we've seen a number of really exciting resources and collaborations come together in order to bring these important pieces of information and tools together. And so the high-level principles is one of those. And another that we can touch on throughout the discussion is the Ocean Panel had released a special report on blue carbon, the Blue Carbon Handbook, which similarly also aims to bring all of those resources together, including the high-level principles, which it had an entire section on, and to be able to bring everyone up to the same level of understanding of what it is that we're talking about blue carbon, particularly because when we hear blue carbon, sometimes we only think of the carbon. And so we want to remember that it is about the communities that live in the coastal ecosystems. It's about the environmental and social impacts of the actions to protect and restore blue carbon ecosystems, so mangroves and seagrasses. And in terms of the Empowering People section, one of the ways that we can see the next steps to really build out those principles would be to start ensuring inclusive participation of all stakeholders in a community, And that can start by making sure that we're setting the right expectations when we go into a community to start exploring what a blue carbon project could look like. Making sure that we know and that our partners know how long it might take to set up, to design, and to start implementing before seeing results. I think that expectation setting is really a key next step. I think that one of the other ways that we want to see the next steps for the empowering people is to really empower the communities to take on their own change and to work together as partners and to co-design some of the projects. And one of the ways that RARE does this is through behavior-centered solutions and working together with the communities towards empowerment from more of a financial perspective. So building financial literacy, providing trainings, and campaigns that allow us to really have that pride to have change together.
Amazing. Josheena, do you want to touch on the other principle?
One of the other principles is about operating locally and contextually. I think very often with blue carbon projects, we tend to really jump onto the success stories and see like how we can just copy paste it in other settings, forgetting that a big reason why a lot of these projects, we don't have a lot of them, do end up working very well sustainably and equitably is because we have the right people at the right place. Engaging for a very long time. So when we go into looking about why certain projects work, there's a lot that we need to do into sort of understanding the social ecological context. And as well as financial literacy, there's so much work to be done also on improving ocean literacy. Sometimes we're trying to get communities to consent to certain projects without them knowing what a mangrove looks like. So it's very important to make sure that we are able to capture those different perspectives. A key component of the high-level principles is also making sure there is free, prior, and informed consent. So I think it's also very important that we define what this is and do more place-based work to contextualize that. So along with empowering people, I think operating locally and contextually goes hand in hand.
Do you mind just touching on what FPIC is in more detail, maybe for the audience who might not know kind of what that is and how to implement FPIC?
That's something I'm looking to do more of now. So at the World Economic Forum, under the Blue Carbon Action Partnership, there's like agreements being set up with national governments, for example, Indonesia. So we are looking to go more within the communities to know what the engagement has looked like. With governments, try to see how early they're planning to engage with local community groups and how they're co-designing and what benefit sharing looks like. So I think the earlier we start, the better it is.
Thank you. So just building on that sort of local capacity building and co-design, Leah, I want to come to you to talk about tech and sort of monitoring, reporting and verification of these projects and how communities can be engaged in that process, but also sort of how projects that maybe are co-designed with communities can sort of evaluate what tech or sort of what monitoring, reporting and verification should look like, how they can engage and sort of,
Yeah, a really great question, and I think a really hot topic with the advent of AI and kind of like tech really coming to the forefront and a drive for integrity, amongst the kind of the carbon market, but really across kind of natural capital projects more broadly. I think kind of one of the key things for me is like one of the things that I've seen is that data is power. So whoever has the kind of the data in their hands and the ability to interpret and understand and communicate what the data is saying really kind of like has the power. And I think this is really one way we can really think about, democratizing and ensuring that blue natural capital projects are equitable. And I think, tech definitely has a role to play in that. We're seeing from like kind of a carbon perspective, I guess you could say, we're certainly seeing a lot of tech solutions out there that are looking to here looking to support the monitoring, reporting, and verification components of blue carbon carbon projects and marine carbon projects. But I think the one thing that I've seen, and maybe AI will change this, is that I'm yet to see a model that really works without input from the ground. And it's the people that are living with, and depending on the resources that or the natural capital that these projects are focused on, they're the best placed people to provide this information. They know what's happening to their resources. They're dependent on them. They're best placed to manage them, and they're best placed to provide this kind of like local context that can help support the tech that's going to enable these markets to go to scale. But I think the last thing I kind of really want to touch on when we talk about rights and in these kind of projects is data sharing. And it's not just a matter of kind of like putting things on a platform. Every stakeholder involved in a natural capital project, whether that be a government, an investor, a community, they all have different needs for that data and different ways of interpreting it and an ability to interpret it. So as we're looking to kind of like share this data and share this tech, ensuring, particularly from a community perspective, that they're inputting into it, and results and data is getting fed back, because particularly when income or finance is dependent on the results of this of the tech data and MRV, then it's super important for the trust and the equity of these projects that communities have access to data in a way that they can understand and communicate within themselves.
Thank you. Suraj, I want to come to you to just build on that piece around trust and data being power, and sort of think about the private sector engagement piece, and sort of also building on what Lisa said around expectation setting being so important, and sort of what from the sort of private sector do you feel is needed to channel the investment that is required into these sort of ecosystems, and how do you use the sort of data and knowledge that Leah's just touched on in that thinking?
Yeah, sure, Maddie. And first of all, thanks a lot for inviting for the panel. As an investment bank, I think the most important thing we need is two things. One is clarity on policies at the international level and national levels. Where does the blue ecosystem, the ecosystem lies, number one. And then the assurance from the buying side of the countries, because no matter how much good quality projects we build up, if it doesn't fit at that NDC sort of driven Paris era, it's a bit challenging for us to channel the investments. So those were the main two. And I think because just to give an example, I used to do these blue carbon projects prior joining Macquarie. So I've been 15 years in the sector, working with the community. So I know if we rush things, we are breaking their hearts and we are breaking their promises, which I hate to do sitting in the private sector. So first of all, the clarity assurance is key. And other thing is we should not bring in external things and try to feed them to the local knowledge. Like I like to build up from the local knowledge for the local knowledge. So that's where I think quite an important thing we want to do. Final, which actually Leah fit in, is the quantification part, because blue carbon is quite an vast area. And at the moment, only mangroves has been really tried to have carbon accounting methodologies, seagrass, corals, there's vast numbers. So that sector should be really improved, I think, to touch upon what Leah mentioned. That's quite critical for us from an investor perspective.
Great, thank you. I think, Ruth, I might come to you to kind of touch on the same topic from a philanthropy perspective, and how sort of philanthropy can help safeguard these groups and sort of enter in at an early stage for some of these projects, while maybe data collection is taking place, or the project needs to sort of be designed, and sort of what role philanthropy can play in that early stage.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me onto the panel. I'm Ruth Boumphrey. I lead the Lloyds Register Foundation, which is a global foundation with a mission for the safety of life and property. And just to take us into that, I want to tell you about the journey that we make in thinking about safety and human safety. So if you think about there's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs for the psychologists out there. You've got this hierarchy of what you need as a human being. And right at the bottom of that is to be safe and feel safe. And when you're working in the maritime and marine environments, it's the most hazardous place to work in the world. Last year at COP, someone said to me, the oceans are the biggest employer in the world, but there's no HR department, right? So if we're asking people to work on our projects and work in the marine environment, on whatever the projects are, natural capital projects, other projects, there is a right to be safe, you know. And so how do we square up the word, what your human rights are, with the word empower? Because you don't empower someone to have their rights, they have their rights. And so it's an interesting, I get a lot of pushback from my colleagues in the foundation about the word empower, and we're trying to remove that from our vocabulary. Because if someone came to me and said, oh, well, I want to empower you in the UK to look after your marine environment, I'd be like, go away. You know, I wouldn't, that's not how I see myself, and why would anyone else see themselves as being empowered? So there's a very interesting psychological piece there, and I think it's wonderful when we meet together in rooms like this, because we're all affirming each other, we're all coming together to affirm each other and to pull the planet in the right direction. We're all pulling in our own ways. But we're trying to go on a journey as a foundation, and we're not very good at it, but we're going to try, right? And that journey is to the local leadership, to be locally led. Because as we think about, okay, where are the people most unsafe in the world, and especially unsafe in the ocean economy, that's not in London. That's not in our wonderful networks of people trying to save the world in Europe. And, you know, these aren't people who are the most unsafe. So the biggest growth will be in places in the world where we haven't had good records of interventions in the past, and where, quite frankly, there's been a lot of loss of human life and a lot of loss of rights because of interventions of the past. So if we look at it like that and say, okay, well, how do we be properly locally led? You know, we are on a journey as a foundation to be locally led, and we've done that through a process of essentially, we're a small foundation, so we're trying to ask ourselves, where are the places where a small foundation can have the biggest impact? In partnership with the United Nations Global Compact, which is a private sector arm of the United Nations. And private sectors for a reason, because alongside, in order to give growth and opportunity, you have to have jobs and economics and money. You know, you can't have rights while you're poor. Poor people don't have rights, they have pressures. You know, they have jobs that they have to do because they don't have any economic power to say no to an unsafe job. So these things all go hand in hand. So we're working with the private sector in 7 countries. I'll just rattle them off in case you're interested. And we're just at the start of this process. So Brazil, Kenya, Ghana, Bangladesh, India, Philippines, and Indonesia. So 7 networks across the world of the private sector who've committed themselves to growing their local marine economy in a safe and sustainable way. And then we will have local groups that will work together and tell us what's needed. And we'll try not to say, no, you don't need that, you need this. So that's our experience as a philanthropist. I think lots of other philanthropists are going on this same journey. Many have, you know, done it very successfully, and hats off to them. But just to acknowledge that in our foundation, we're on that journey, and it's about rights. It's not about empowering, in our view.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I think kind of taps into a lot of what we've just discussed in terms of needing to focus on the local context, but also kind of what that looks like and what external support is needed to help those projects. And I think recently there has been quite a lot of controversy around sort of natural capital, and specifically around terrestrial voluntary carbon markets. And I just wanted to sort of ask what that has done for people engaging in the sector, and sort of, is there a fear of reputational risk, and sort of, what kind of experience that you've had. I don't know, Suraj, if you want to focus on that.
Yeah, Maddie, I mean, that's a good question, I would say. So when I joined the team 2 years ago, first thing what I did was applied the ground level experience we had in having a quality project and created an internal criteria which had about 25 criterias, including social, governance, political, and then like environmental, all criterias. And only if a project fit into that and pass it, we'll take it into the seconds level. So because of that, I think we've been able to guard keep and take off a lot of bad projects that came off under our radar. We probably looked at over 160 projects, and I only have 3 taken. So it gives you the perspective how much work we had to do within 12 months or like 18 months to do. So we as an investment bank, we are very optimistic on the future. We don't really worry about reputation risk because we are taking internal safeguards to assess and then take it to the project. So I think, yes, there are conversations on bad press, but I think we have our internal team to make sure that Macquarie doesn't get involved in a bad project. And I know that there are other investors are looking at it in a positive way. So I'm optimistic.
Lisa, did you want to come in from an NGO perspective?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that that a lot of the concern and the risks that we're hearing in the media about REDD+ and other terrestrial projects is a way to help us mitigate those issues from a blue carbon or a coastal perspective. I think that Leah said it earlier that that data is power and knowledge is power, and so now knowing what we've learned from the history of REDD+ allows us to really act accordingly and to be able to learn from all of the technical, social, and environmental safeguards that have been built, the institutional arrangements that have been built, and really understanding what's worked and what hasn't and how it's changed over the years, which allows us to learn from that and to be better from a blue carbon perspective and to learn together with more of a landscape approach. So while my REDD+ is more from my past life, and for RARE, we focus more on the coastal ecosystems, but it's still very relevant for us as well. I guess the example that I'll give is the lessons that we can learn from nesting and taking a jurisdictional approach. While RARE is a very community-based, behavior-centered approach organization, we take a local level and small-scale approach to our blue carbon work or any of our community work, understanding what that means to be able to nest together for moving towards a jurisdictional or a landscape scale approach will be really important for organizations like RARE and others that are looking to build out both robust and responsible and successful blue carbon projects.
Great. I think I've just done exactly what I'm about to ask, was that often we focus on sort of reputational risk of investors and the financial sector, what the finance risk might be, but actually sort of I wanted to touch on what might the risks of these projects and this sort of market emerging might be on communities. And who would like to take that one, Leah or Josheena?
Sure. I think a lot of time in blue carbon conversations, I hear so much about we need to increase capacity to measure the carbon, especially in less developed regions. And then the whole, like, how do we continue ensuring sustainable management of resources for communities comes as an afterthought. And I really like what Leah said earlier about data is power, but so like, and again, that pitch that we need social ecological data here again to understand the risks and the impact that these projects will have. And also understanding how these areas have cultural heritage values, how management has been done in the past. We see a lot of areas where rights-based management approach has already been integrated, whether it's for protected areas or other initiatives. So like having a more historical understanding of how areas have been managed, how cultural heritage values have been included, and how to continue integrating those principles in blue carbon projects is essential. So I would say like starting these conversations earlier on will help mitigate some of those risks. But I'm sure Leah will have more to add.
Yeah, some really great points there, Josheena, and I fully agree. I think, yeah, this is a massive topic and a very relevant topic, as we are seeing the kind of the interest from I guess the investment sector, and it's good to see these resources beginning to be valued for everything that they provide. This kind of blue natural capital it is now being realised, but it definitely does place risks on the communities and the indigenous people that are dependent on these resources for food security and livelihoods, and that absolutely must not be forgotten as we kind of really look to touching on the last subject, like learning from Red and some of the mistakes there. And I think the thing that I think the oceans are unique, and how people use them are unique. They're most commonly common pool resources, which means that it's hard. With a plot of forest, it's a lot easier to say, okay, somebody owns this. With the ocean, that's not often the case. From like a kind of, there's a policy angle, and there's also like a personal and a family and a village angle to that. And I think that's one of the things that really does place local people and communities at risk from exploitation. And I think one of the things that we can really do to help ensure rights and ensure that these natural capital projects are equitable is to ensure that there are clear and accessible pathways to management rights. If you're taking carbon, for an example, ownership or proof of control is one of the fundamental pieces you need to show in order to be able to have a carbon project. If communities or local people, or the people that rightfully own these resources, can't show that, then they're inherently already disadvantaged. So really thinking about those kind of like pathways to clear, legal, transparent rights to their resources is really important. And I guess the other thing I wanted to kind of touch on, it's around safeguards, but we talk about FPIC, and I fully agree kind of with everything else that the panelists have said, and I really encourage us to think kind of beyond FPIC. Really to that local leadership. So it's not just kind of like involvement, but it's leadership on the ground. But FPIC still needs to be done on these. There's a lot of this is a locally owned project. And people can kind of like ignore the FPIC component. But from my experience, it's just as important at that level, because inequity exists in villages. Like we all know, in wherever we've come from. I come from a small fishing village in Cornwall, and there's definitely a hierarchy. And there's a lot of potential for elite capture, and you often don't think that that's the case, but it is. So ensuring that there are kind of these pathways for democratically owned and run projects is really important.
Thank you. Ruth, I didn't know if you wanted to come in on some of the work you've done with the UN Global Compact, on some examples of where you've worked to address some of the risks that Leah and Josheena may have just touched on.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to just share some of our thoughts on that. And I just want to say also, I just really agree with what you guys are saying, just to reinforce that. I feel like very much, I haven't got much to add here. But, on the risks to communities, there is, to me, the additional thing to think about here is corporate structures. Because whenever we set up sources of generating income or sources of capital, there's always people who manage to find a way to profit from that, or to disproportionately take the wealth from those systems. And I'm always think about the Watergate thing about follow the money. Let's make sure we're following where the investment goes, where is who's benefiting as investment goes into the systems, and we need to find ways to track that. The thing I wanted to share was about engineering guilt. And you might think, well, what's that about? Why should you talk about that? So in the foundation, our mission is engineering a safer world. And if you go into any engineering society in London, it's filled with retired gentlemen who've done a fantastic job of of doing the engineering they were asked to do to bring us power and heat and roads and transport and factories and all the things that keep us alive and well. And now they're being told the thing that you just did has caused this massive problem of climate change. And now we're all having to work hard to unpick the thing that we asked you to do 30, 40, 50 years ago. And there's a guilt that follows that. There's a guilt which can be paralyzing, which is that you might do the wrong thing, that as you go forward, we might choose the wrong things to invest in the wrong projects, that natural capital might end up having unintended consequences. And I think that follows any kind of philanthropy as well. You get projects brought to you and you think, well, this sounds really interesting. It's a very plausible thing. But how do we sort of play off the risks here? How do we make sure that we bring in equity, that we're not creating another injustice, another unjust transition as we go forward, and not creating a problem for the future? So to get back to your sort of question directly, there's one thing that we did when we were thinking about seaweed. We were looking at seaweed in about 4 or 5 years ago, and I had a bunch of different seaweed micro entrepreneurs in the room in London. Some farmers, some people turning it into plastic, someone who wanted to do food, someone wanted the carbon credits. And I didn't know what to do. They all want to do different things, essentially, around seaweed. And I said, right, you have to get together and agree the principles by which, if you want to grow your market and you want to do it together, you're going to have to put some principles in the middle of the seaweed industry. And they went away and they developed something called the Seaweed Manifesto, and then COVID hit. And everyone started turning up to all the conferences globally. And then the next thing you know, I think there were 800 signatories to the Seaweed Manifesto. And I think that's sort of, okay, well, if we're going to get this wrong, at least we all had a bit of a say. I hope we get it right. I hope, that the different NGOs that went in and signed up to that manifesto, they're kind of like, in the best possible way, we think this is a good thing, that this is not going to create a problem, that we're not going wrong, we're going down a good pathway here. And the second thing I just wanted to mention was a project we got upcoming, which is about nature-positive engineering, which, we talk a lot about nature-based engineering, nature-positive engineering. Again, if we want to take those ideas and scale them, we have to have the measures and the data in place that show us that project and that project and that project, we can't keep doing lots of little projects without teaching it out, without getting it into our engineering schools, without getting our governments to pay for the benefits that they will see, without getting investors to pay for the benefits. And to do that, you actually have to sort of codify and standardize benefits coming out of these projects. So that's something that we're looking to do to at least gather people around that table of nature-positive engineering, that we can get standards and that we can get teachable standards in our engineering and other schools, so that we can start to do this at scale and stop the old engineering, which is still being taught, 30, 40-year-old curriculums in engineering schools. So that's my perspective on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Suraj, just kind of building off what Ruth just touched on, from a sort of private sector example of a successful project, also maybe touching on your past life, but also I know that we touched on it earlier about sort of the longevity of benefit and the sort of long-term sustainability of a project. And so, just wanted to know if you had any examples up your sleeve.
Yeah, sure, Maddie. I think, some of the projects that Leah worked on in Blue Vanga, I think that's quite an interesting project, because they really learned from the communities, understood their voice, and then took the carbon, not try to impose carbon on a new environment. So that's, I think, very key to success. And one of the projects that I worked in Myanmar, so the trial plots, land edification, it all took at least 5 to 6 years before really carbon was applied. So those stories are more successful, and ensuring that at least 50 to 60% of the benefit goes to the communities. It's reported in a transparent way, reported for the governments, and also not mixing with governments' ambitions to the Paris Agreement, because often there is another issue where each country is now responsible under the Paris Agreement. So we should understand how much, where is the unconditional NDCs, conditional NDCs are lying. That's some of the thing. And one final thing I want to touch upon is basically NGO, government sector are working in one plane, and then the private sector often working in another plane. So when I joined cross paths. I really understood there's a difference in sometimes in communication, so I think that really should be connected, where I sit in both parties so I can understand what both parties are saying. I think the more it should happen, once that happens, when all parties are walking on the same road, same directions, I think more private sector financing will come in. Otherwise, when I go to some conferences, there's only carbon people. There's no blue carbon. And when I come here, sometimes I'm probably the only investor. There are few investors, but I like to see more mix about it. And then I think that's really important. So I'll end from there, but happy to answer any questions.
How do you propose we get that mix?
Actually, if I had the answer, I think we had solved a lot of problems. But I think there are good committed organizations in the private sector, including people from who has been in the sector joining. I think we should more get involved, as I try to always try to involve with the NGOs, government sector, try to get understanding what are the local knowledges happening, what do they need, and then how can I, sitting in the other side of the spectrum, how can we help bridge the gap? So I tried my best, and I hope everyone joins the same. Yes.
Did you want to add anything, Josheena? You look like you want to.
It just reminds me of the earlier conversation about bridging gaps, yes, but also opening doors to more actors. We're talking about how there's not enough actors from the global south, and we're discussing why is that, talking about how all the projects that get rejected at your level, why is that happening, and how do we bring more actors? Something that Suraj had mentioned earlier was talking about the legitimacy of the partners proposing projects. And in my case, I come across a lot of NGOs, locally led NGOs, who want to get into blue carbon markets and benefit from the finance tools, but don't necessarily know how to get there. So, sometimes we're here and we're talking about, we need to include, do better with integrating local and indigenous knowledge, but there's also the other end of the spectrum. How do we get good locally led organizations to be here? So,
thank you for adding that. I'm just going to fling a question out and see if anybody wants to answer it. But a lot of the themes that have come up are around integrating indigenous knowledge and therefore sort of the more qualitative knowledge, sort of data, and sort of how best should we be integrating that sort of side of things into these discussions, and if there's any good examples of where that's been done, and sort of being mindful of the fact that that side of things is as important and needs to also be shared between organisations and different groups. So if anybody would like to touch on that, you would.
That's an excellent question. One thing that I think really also builds off of what you were just saying is that that there's a need for strong relationships at the local level, and to really be able to build trust between each other in order to make sure that you know that there's the right, that everyone has their heart in the right place in a way, and that you can trust that they'll do what they say, that we'll do what we say, really. I think that there's a really great way of being able to work at the local level over time, and to be able to, again, build those relationships and develop the trust. And one of the examples that I'll share is Rare helped to launch the Coastal 500 network, which is a series of coastal mayors across the globe, who are all working on small-scale fisheries, ecosystem-based adaptation, not necessarily blue carbon yet, but we have all of the elements that we are talking about in terms of coastal protection, the biodiversity benefits, the livelihoods benefits, and the network is a way that we can build the trust of the communities and have the trust in us, and the rest of the partners, and to be able to share experiences across all of those.
Great. Leah, did you want to add?
Yeah, I don't have a massive amount to add. It's a super interesting conversation. I think I would also kind of completely agree that this kind of more qualitative storytelling piece is really important. But I think, I would also like us to challenge the sector's ability to integrate data from fishers and from people. When you counting fish, understanding catch, when it comes to carbon, it is complicated. There's no denying it. But when you really boil it down, it's measuring a tree and doing some adding up. And I think a lot of it is about kind of communication. There is more to it than that. Trust me, I do understand. But I think it would be really nice to think about how can we, I guess bridge the gap, through tech, through tools, through communication, and really try and elevate the data, the excellent data that is coming kind of from villages and from kind of management associations, to be able to be included in these kind of in these bigger conversations to kind of complement the more qualitative data that is also very important. So yeah, it's a really interesting subject. We're in Suraj is actually supporting this as well with Plan Vivo. We're in the process of developing a kind of a new methodology for blue carbon projects focused on locally led initiatives, and really trying to kind of think about how can we make this understandable to everybody, because it's not just, I'm not going to lie, with a university degree, when I first started this 10 years ago, I couldn't really understand the carbon methodology. So something's wrong there. I'm really trying to kind of push the boundaries and think about how can we make this more accessible and not just for blue carbon, but kind of across the sector as well. So.
Thank you for sharing that. We'll be looking out for that, definitely. Ruth, sorry, did you want to add something, or were you just?
No,
passing?
I just think I'm just thinking about how cool it would be to have a sort of citizen science kind of collection of data. I mean, the bottom-up collection of data, and I was reflecting on the last UN Ocean conference in Lisbon, and the best bit was actually meeting your organisation. Was outside of the zone, outside of this, right? Outside of this kind of, there was this collection of artisan fishermen who were all getting together to launch something. They had tables with all the different languages, they could all sit in different languages, and they hadn't been invited into the room. There was no space for them in the room to talk about what they wanted as artisan fishermen. And there's something in my head which is about, you don't invite people to the table, they have to go and make their own table, right? So how do we go and make that much more exciting, and everyone kind of leaves the blue zone and goes into the green zone, because it's a much more happening place to be. So there's just something there, I think, which is about how we sort of demonstrate our power. A blue badge, right? You've got a blue badge for that. You have to sign up for that, and it's an exclusive club that we're in here. And how do we shift that away, shift the data away, and move the dial on the equity in these processes. Yeah.
I think that's an important thing for us all to think about, not just at these COPs, but generally when we're discussing projects such as these, how do we make the space and how do we open up the conversation and not maybe talk at such a high level, sort of a removed level from what we're actually talking about on the ground. I want to open up the panel to the floor. If anyone has any an early question.
Hello. Habari. I'm Rahma Jawa, founder and CEO of Rahami Aquaculture from Tanzania. We're actually doing the land-based seaweed farming for the primary aim of the increasing production, reducing ocean acidification, and at the same time harvesting of the blue carbon. I've been so happy to be in this platform. But what is I really need to know from you guys, I've seen everybody's you're talking about the blue carbon, but we have not seen how are we using the technology, because the way we do it, we have not get the formula yet. How are we going to calculate ours? Because we actually pump the water from the oceans, but before we allow the water getting into our seaweed dams, we use the IoT technology to measure the parameter of the water that come up with. Actually, we do the all other green gases emission, carbon dioxide, salinity, and pH. Then we allow the water go to our dams. But before there, we let at least 1 hour, 3 hours the water just to be there. And then during photosynthesis, you find the seaweed absorb all carbon dioxide and all other green gases emissions. But we measure carbon maybe before water, it's take maybe 60. And after staying in the seaweed, we come and realize that seaweed has been absorbed something like, we found like 45 carbon. Then we harvest like 15 or something. Then from there, we allow the water getting back to the ocean. So with that, we basically do it every day within 24 hours. And we find that our pump capacity has like 50,000 liters in an hour. So when we try to go to the carbon market, because our model is a little bit unique, we are able to quantify. It's like the amount the carbon come up with and the amount the carbon go with. But unfortunately, like when we try like communicating with those who are trying to take the blue carbon market, they say they cannot find the formulas because this is a unique, is a technical. So like being here, it's like I know I made a lot of carbon expertise, people who have knowledge. At least you'll just help us through. We get to know like how are we going to calculate, how are we going to get into the market, because we have a big data. Our data is 24 hours, 46 days within a day. So we have a big data of calculating the amount before and amount after. And the difference is that's what we have been harvesting. So I really need maybe if somebody who can just help us to see how can technological carbon harvesting can get into the carbon market. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Does anybody want to, Leah?
That's a really fascinating case study. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think this is really exactly what we need. We need this kind of elevation of data from people that are actually really trying to do it. I don't have an answer to you, I'm not going to lie. Let's definitely chat after the call. But it aligns very nicely. There are several initiatives at the moment that I'm involved in, and the organizations I work with are involved in, particularly looking at seascapes. So it's looking at kind of like the connectivity of our coastlines and our oceans, particularly with a focus on carbon. And I think this really kind of like fits in there. And, you know, seaweed is a big topic. It's incredibly important from food security and, you know, kind of nature positive and everything like that. So there's a big focus on that. And, you know, as a sector, we're trying to work out what does this mean kind of like from a quantification for a climate, because it obviously has a positive impact, but what does that look like in the current framework of the carbon market? So I'd love to kind of like, hear any more information after the talk and any data that you may have, and we can definitely, further explore and ensure that this data is input into the conversations that are happening. So thank you again.
Can I just add in there? I think that's fascinating what you've been asking as well, and it feels to me that this is the right place to have a kind of accelerator model for technology exchange, because the answers to your technology need are out there. You know, they're definitely in the oceanographic institutes and others that are around this area. It's just you haven't had a match between the need and the people holding the technology, you know, way more sophisticated technologies. But so how do you match that and make that affordable at scale? So an accelerator is a great mechanism for doing that, for matching technology needs from fragmented, you know, stakeholders, and then asking technologists to come in with what they've already got, you know, and adapting it to the right environment. So it feels like the right time to have an accelerator in this space.
Hi. Thanks so much. So my name is Adam. I'm from an organization called Planet Indonesia. And I was just curious if you guys could comment on this disconnect between securing tenure and getting projects carbon ready. I think I have myself and Novi, my co-founder, we have an email in our Google Doc that we just copy paste because we get so many emails from carbon project developers who are interested in project sites. And then we say, okay, well, tenure's not secured there. And this could be a 1 to 7 year process that costs anywhere from $250,000 to over $1 million. And rightfully also tenure, probably from a community's perspective, has so much more social and cultural value than the carbon there. And in general, most project developers will respond, great, go to philanthropy and come back to us once tenure is secured. And so I see this big disconnect in whether it be blue carbon or green carbon or whatever space, that basically rights for IPLCs is seen as this checkbox that we have to check before a project is carbon ready. And one, that doesn't value the social, cultural aspects of rights, I think. But number two, also who's willing to pay for the rights? Are we just going to continually kind of go to philanthropy for that? And so I guess my question for the panel, and from based on what you said, I think we're all on the same page on this, but how do we move the needle on this issue, particularly around tenure? And how do we get more project developers, investors, and bankers to take that risky investment that it may take 5 to 6 years to secure tenure? And then even after that, communities still might not choose to take this to a carbon project, right? So just would love to hear anyone from the panel's perspective on that.
I mean, that's a question, Adam, I've been struggling for 15 years from being a developer and now here. Because when I was a project developer, it was the problem is who's going to pay. Now I see it here, it's like, okay, we will pay it, but then what assurance we have that there is a project? So I think that's why when I said that the challenge is, if you have an assurance on the demand side, then I think investors would be willing to invest in that initial process. But if there's no demand side, because the demand side is still emerging, that's actually a question I've been thinking for 15 years. So if like now we are at the 28th COP, right? So I think we are moving towards this Paris era, NDC. So I think one thing is respective governments should take quite a number of bold steps to help this. If they also want to bring in foreign sector, private sector financing, they also should take a leading role on that. Because let's say sometimes the coastal ecosystems doesn't have a owner, probably it owns by the government. And then if we put it, is that fitting into their NDCs, which is nationally determined contributions, where does the right lies, right? So I've seen sometimes proposals come on our desk as well, but when we look at it, the owner doesn't actually have the right, so we have to then decline it. So I think I don't have the full answer, but one is that respective governments are knowing that what's happening in the international level. So that clarity being provided at national level, and then from the other side, the other countries providing more indication on the demand side, private sector capital would find channel into that level. Does it help a little? Yeah? Okay, thanks. Anyone?
I think I would just add briefly too that that's certainly a question that we're grappling with as well. And one of the things that we're looking into to start to address this is really finding or hopefully finding those the investors that are willing to have more of an early investment for readiness and for developing those enabling conditions that are inclusive of tenure rights, but also go beyond that to some of the other policy conditions that we were just talking about. That's certainly a gap in the financing space, and that's a gap for the project design as well, as you well know.
Hi there, Sian Henley from the University of Edinburgh in the UK. I have learnt a lot over the last half an hour or 45 minutes. It's been great. But you very much had a focus on the projects that have gone ahead or could go ahead. So my question is about those that will not or should not, pertaining to the risk associated, either in terms of the local community not receiving an equitable share in the business or the profits, or from an environmental point of view. So I wonder if you could comment on the sort of ground rules for which projects should absolutely not go ahead.
No. I can say something. I mean, yeah. I mean, from an investment side, I mean, I always think when I look at a project, where would the communities get the benefit, and how that is addressing that nation's ambitions, because an investor can just come in and take all the rights, but then how is that respective country is addressing it to the Paris Agreement, and what promise are we giving to the communities? So I think. So, like I said, we have our own internal criteria, which think 90% of these projects that come on our desk, I'm just taking off because I tell them that, you know, if you correct these, if you have a proper land right, if you do the proper local stakeholder consultation, everything that should done. And I think from a standards perspective, like Vera, Gold Standard, Plan Vivo, and all these standards are also should be and are quite cautious about it. And I think the awareness, like media presence, because social media is so powerful now than before, and then the use of technology, satellite images, so everything pulled together, I think, was a reflection for the last 2 years, what we are seeing. And I think going forward, we as an investor and everyone, I think NGOs, government, we all have to work together. Otherwise, it'll always, you know, we'll never success. It's my thoughts, personal thoughts, but anyone?
I think overall, what we mentioned earlier, right, bridging the gaps to make sure that we are able to feel, like to increase synergy so that, you know, you have less projects that get rejected at the end of the day is important. And I think what we have all been trying to say here is like bringing more clarity to us here, like people on the ground and all the intermediaries as well. Yeah, and making sure we are aligned first before we are able to like communicate that further.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Mayor. I'm one of the mayors of the Coastal 500 with RARE. I really appreciate you pointing out the role of communities in terms of understanding the risks. But I'd like to highlight the role of local chief executives, mayors, administrative officers in different small localities where many of you has worked with, and their appreciation of the data that you have been mentioning, and how do we now make the data be more palatable to people who are in a position to influence the risk that you are all mentioning. You know, an elective position would be in different scenarios, would be at least 3, 4, 5 years, depending on your national government. And a lot of the discussions are happening at the national level, but a lot of your programs are happening on the local level. And there's the gap in terms of appreciation of what you are all saying happens in the middle managers that are mostly local chief executives or mayors who are there for a short period of time. So I think if there's an opportunity for you to merge all of those concerns and make it, you know, like a templatable method of checking of how do we move forward with possible investments in the local level, we might be able to reduce the risk because there's now assurance of understanding who owns what, of what particular area, and there's clarity in terms of policy that it can be sustained over time. And I think this opportunity now for CAP recognizing local action to influence global outcomes is a very good step for us to move forward. And I really hope that you as experts might consider these middle managers the same way we do in corporations. How do we now cascade communication towards these middle managers to be able to move forward with all the programs that you want to do and have impactful results towards the community, towards the investors, towards the different stakeholders that you all have mentioned today?
Does anybody want to touch or talk to that? Pardon? I think we have 1 minute left, so you can talk to it if you want. And then we can wrap up.
Oh, there it is. Very clever. Very, very good point. Yeah, I can agree more. And I think that does highlight, a gap in kind of what was spoken about where, yeah, I'm lucky enough to live in Madagascar for the last 10 years. And the community groups that I've worked with over those 10 years, it is those local government officials that are most important for supporting the management that they're doing. If that doesn't function, then there's no support for the government. So I completely agree, and I do definitely think that's something that as a sector we should really think about. And it kind of, when I was before we were talking about words to rap with or whatever, and I think it is this collaboration and meaningful inclusion. I think that's one kind of like common theme that was spoken about across all of this is really thinking about who matters. all different stakeholders and ensuring that the data and the information that underpin these projects is shared with those that real meaningful inclusion and thinking about what that means. So yeah.
I think you've just wrapped it up for me. I couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I think it's definitely given everyone a lot to think about. It's definitely given me a lot to think about. So yeah, thank you so much.